Thank you very much first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for having invited me. And I do think this is a very remarkable event also for a German-Polish debate on these issues. So I'm grateful for participating in this conference, being invited by Friedrich Ebert and the Demos Europa, which I understand is a think tank nurturing the debate here in Poland. I should possibly start with the first remark, which is not on the slide. But like my colleague, Professor Fieler, I'm talking in a purely personal capacity here. And I will, of course, also refrain from giving good advice to a Polish audience, how its position on the entry into the euro, the strategy, and the entry point should be. I should confess that I've been following the Polish debate now for basically 7-8 years. I recall being at a conference in Krynica a couple of years ago, and I understood that the debate has some sort of a cycle with regard to whether one should enter or not the euro. I'd simply fulfill the assignment which I was given by Knut Detlefsen, the new or incoming director of Friedrich Ebert Foundation here. That is, what I'd like to do is to give you a bit of background on the history of European Monetary Union. Then my second point will be about the famous admission criteria to the club and why we do think they are sensible. The third point will be about going briefly into the financial crisis and issues in the debate which arose with regard to the currency union out of that. And finally, I'll pick up some issues which are currently under debate. I'll be probably too rapid, but will stick within my 10-15 minutes allocated. So let me start with a little bit of historical background. EMU, in fact, is the upshot of the unraveling of the Bretton Woods system in the early 70s. The high volatility of AVEX rates meant for Europe that it was very difficult to have the level of integration in terms of trade flows, capital flows, which Europe would want to have. That's why Europe yearned for stability in AVEX markets. And it started early on with the snake, the tunnel in the snake, the European monetary system, which was strengthened over the 80s and 90s. And in effect, as a result of the EMS crisis, there was the resolve to go towards a common currency, which was strongly emphasized. So there are phases within the EMS and the European monetary system, and became pretty clear early on that this was an incomplete system. That's the notion by Paul de Grauwe, a Belgian economist. Why did Europe ultimately embark on the monetary union process? And here I'll reiterate points which have been made by Finance Minister Roskovsky. There was an important report in 1990 called One Market, One Money, which largely made the case that there's a so-called unholy trinity. It is very difficult to have independent monetary policy, fixed exchange rates, and free flow of capital and goods. That's why, in order to reap the microeconomic advantages one needed for the one market, one money. This was a very European view, by the way. You might recall then that in the US case, where at around the same period NAFTA was founded, the North American Free Trade Area, nobody spoke about taking out the US dollar, taking out the Mexican peso or the Canadian dollar out of the game. But in Europe, we do believe that the common currency is a device to underwrite, to allow for the benefits of the common market. In fact, what one actually does there in purely economic terms, one does think that markets are not working perfectly. FX markets are not working perfectly. They are creating too much volatility. Now, what is monetary union? This is the most important slide I'd like to present to you. In economic terms, it's pretty simple. It's just taking out the nominal exchange rate, nothing but. This is important because it might be sensible in certain economic environments to have the nominal exchange rate as an absorption mechanism to cushion, to adjust to shocks, at least if those shocks are temporary and if they don't, and if prices are not perfectly flexible. Now, if you don't have the nominal exchange rate anymore, then of course in order to adapt to imbalances, you have substitutes. Economics is essentially the science about substitutes. And the substitutes in our case are to adapt to shocks, cross-border labor migration, fiscal transfers within a monetary union, and the flexibility of relative prices. And in this case, mainly the flexibility of real wages. And these three things, which are actually just coming out of the background idea to a monetary union, namely the Mandel-Fleming model, these three substitutes are substitutes which many don't like too much. In the German case, for example, if you would like to sell monetary union with the argument that you need more fiscal transfers, that would be a tough sell. A really tough sell. Cross-border labor migration, me personally, I'd never understood when we embarked on the common market why we didn't accept early on all the cross-border labor migration. At the end of the day, it basically boils down to the responsiveness of real wages. And I'll come back to that later on. But taking out the nominal exchange rate, adapting to external shocks means that you need a significant amount of flexibility of relative prices, in particular real exchange rates. This one will be very brief. Maastricht criteria. What one wanted to see, in particular in a non-economic but more political-oriented debate, is to create the preconditions for what we in Germany call Kultur der Preisstabilität. Stabilitätskultur. Pretty German notion. Which means that in order to enter into the club, you should fulfill honor criteria with regard to the level of inflation rate. My colleague from the Polish National Bank spoke about 4 percentage points of inflation, which is way above what we would like to see in monetary union. It's about interest rates, it's about exchange rates. In fact, these are, if you would put it in an economic model, they are basically redundant. If you fulfill on a lasting basis the inflation criterion, you should, of course, also fulfill the nominal interest rate criterion if it's credible. And as a result of that interest rate parity, the exchange rate should also be within the range which is defined as being acceptable. Now, fiscal criteria are mainly about the sustainability of public debt, and we are now in an environment where the finance minister alluded to sustainability is heavily threatened. And finally, independence of the central bank. So the purposes of these criteria is largely to generate the prerequisites for a viable monetary union.